Most people prepare for money. Some prepare for success. Almost no one prepares for old age, and that is why old age destroys them. In his first teachings, the Buddha did not begin with happiness. He began with old age, sickness, and death, not to frighten people, but because he understood something most people spend their whole lives avoiding. Aging is not a surprise, it is guaranteed. Yet most people live as if it will somehow be different for them. They exhaust the body, they clutter the mind, they depend on others without noticing it. They avoid discipline until it becomes too late for discipline to help them. Then one day, the body weakens, the mind grows restless, and they realize with a kind of quiet shock that no one can walk this path for them. This is not about extending life forever. That was never the promise. This is about not suffering unnecessarily when old age arrives, because there is a kind of suffering that comes from aging itself, and there is another kind that comes entirely from being unprepared. The second kind is optional. 1. Accept aging before it arrives. The Buddha taught that suffering does not begin with pain itself. It begins with refusing to see things clearly. Aging becomes unbearable not because the body changes, but because the mind insists it should not. That refusal creates a second layer of suffering, one that is entirely self-made. From a young age, people are quietly trained to deny aging. Youth is praised, strength is admired, speed is rewarded. Society tells you, without ever saying it directly, that value comes from being sharp, productive, attractive, and capable. Over time, this message sinks in. People begin to build their identity on these things without realizing it. And somewhere beneath the surface, they quietly believe they will escape the full weight of aging. They never say this out loud, but the belief is there. They expect to remain mentally quick, physically capable, socially respected, emotionally in control. This belief feels comforting. But it is false, and false beliefs are dangerous because reality does not negotiate. When the body begins to slow, when memory softens, when appearance changes, the mind panics. It says this should not be happening. That thought alone multiplies the suffering. The pain of aging is one thing. The shock of resistance is another. The Buddha was clear about this distinction. Pain is inevitable. Suffering is optional. Real self-care does not begin with medicine or support from others. It begins decades earlier with mental honesty. You have to look at impermanence before it forces itself upon you. Your body will weaken. This is not a personal failure. It is biology. Your face will change. This is not a loss of worth. It is nature. Your speed will slow. This is not laziness. It is aging. Your authority may fade. People may listen less. This is not injustice. This is how worldly value works. The Buddha never asked people to pretend these things are pleasant. He asked them to see these things clearly, and clear seeing is the beginning of peace. Those who accept aging early are not surprised by it later. When change arrives, they recognize it. They have already sat with it in the mind. They have already made a kind of quiet peace with it. Because of this, they do not panic. They do not collapse. They do not waste what remains wishing for what is already gone. Instead, they adapt. They shift priorities. They conserve energy. They let go of unnecessary battles. This is not weakness. This is intelligence. Resistance, on the other hand, drains the mind. A resisting mind argues with reality all day long. It compares itself to younger versions of itself. It obsesses over loss. It replays memories like accusations against the present. This inner conflict exhausts a person far more than aging ever could. Acceptance does not mean giving up. It means stopping the internal war. It means saying, this is happening whether I like it or not. How will I respond wisely? Many people misunderstand acceptance. They think it means passivity. It does not. In this context, acceptance is clarity. It is seeing what cannot be changed so you can act skillfully within what can. When you accept that the body is aging, you stop demanding impossible things from it. You rest when needed. You move gently instead of forcing. You choose care over punishment. When you accept that status fades, you stop chasing validation. When you accept that roles disappear, you begin to discover who you are without them. The Buddha encouraged regular reflection on aging. Not once, not occasionally, regularly, not to make life grim, to make it honest. A mind that reflects on aging is not shocked when it arrives. Sit with this truth sometimes. This body is aging. Don't rush past it. Don't decorate it with philosophy. Just let it land. Fear may appear. Sadness may appear. Resistance may appear. That is fine. Observe them. Don't suppress them. Don't dramatize them. Over time, something shifts. The mind stops reacting so violently. Aging becomes familiar rather than threatening. You begin to plan realistically instead of fantasizing. You begin to value peace over appearance, depth over speed, wisdom over approval. People who never reflect on aging are the ones most devastated by it. They feel betrayed by life. They feel cheated. They feel angry at their own bodies. That bitterness poisons the years that remain. People who reflect early feel sadness, yes, but not bitterness. They grieve without collapsing. They adjust without resentment. They age without becoming hostile to life itself. Acceptance is not a single decision. It is a daily orientation. Each time you notice stiffness, forgetfulness, fatigue, or slowing, there is a choice. Resist and suffer more, or acknowledge and adapt. The mind trained in acceptance does not suffer less because life becomes kinder. It suffers less because it stops demanding that life be different from what it is. Old age does not suddenly begin at a certain number. It begins the moment you stop accepting change. Prepare now, not by fearing aging, but by understanding it. This is where real self-care begins. 2. Discipline the body while it still listens. The body is a tool, and like all tools, it requires care if you expect it to function when you need it most. Most people misunderstand this completely. When they are young, they treat the body as if it is indestructible. They overeat, they undermove, they sleep poorly. They push and push without thinking about what they are borrowing. They take loans from the body without realizing those loans carry interest. And old age is when the bill arrives. Old age is not when the body suddenly stops listening. Old age is when you feel the cost of how you lived. Discipline here is not punishment, it is protection. The middle way the Buddha described exists for a reason. Extreme indulgence damages the body. Extreme neglect does the same. Discipline keeps the body stable enough to support clarity and dignity later in life. When the body is young, it forgives quickly. When it ages, it does not. This is why the habit of care must be built while the body still responds easily. Not perfectly, consistently. You do not need obsession. You do not need to chase performance or appearance. What is needed is regular, unglamorous care. Walking instead of sitting endlessly. Stretching instead of letting joints freeze. Eating simply instead of excessively. Sleeping at reasonable hours instead of abusing stimulation. These things seem minor. That is why people dismiss them. But aging is not shaped by dramatic moments. It is shaped by thousands of ordinary days. People say, "I'll take care of myself later." This is a common misunderstanding. Later is when habits are harder to change. Later is when damage is already embedded. Later is when the body resists correction most. There is also a psychological dimension here that often goes unnoticed. A body cared for regularly gives the mind a quiet stability, not arrogance, stability. When the body functions reasonably well, the mind has fewer distractions. An uncared for body constantly pulls attention toward discomfort. Patience thins. Frustration increases. Everything becomes harder. A stable body supports a stable mind. This remains true through every decade of life. Discipline also preserves dignity. The ability to walk without significant pain, to sit without stiffness, to sleep without constant interruption. These things feel ordinary now. In old age, they are priceless, and they are built quietly over many years. The Buddha did not promise that discipline prevents aging. He understood that it reduces suffering within aging. Treat the body like something borrowed, not owned. Maintain it while it still responds. Respect it while it still listens. One day it will not cooperate the way it does now. That day is coming regardless of what you choose. Those who prepared will find it easier. Those who neglected it will find it harder. This is simply how causes and conditions work. 3. Train the mind to be alone. One of the greatest sufferings of old age is not physical. It is the loneliness of a mind that never learned to rest within itself. This is where most people misunderstand the problem. Loneliness is not caused by being alone. It is caused by a mind that has never been trained to sit quietly without needing something from the outside. When people are young, they surround themselves with noise, conversation, entertainment, social roles, constant stimulation. They mistake busyness for meaning. They mistake connection for dependence. As long as those things are available, they feel fine. But they never train the mind to stand on its own. Then old age arrives. Friends pass away. Social circles shrink. Children become busy. Attention fades. Silence increases. For an untrained mind, that silence is unbearable. It feels like abandonment. It feels like erasure. But this is not because old age is cruel. It is because the mind was never prepared for quiet. There is an important distinction to understand here. Training the mind to be alone is not about isolation. It is about inner independence. If your peace depends on company, praise, conversation, or distraction, then peace will collapse when those things disappear. Old age removes them slowly, sometimes quickly. A mind that cannot be alone is a mind that depends on conditions it cannot control. Being alone, in the sense meant here, means being present without escaping. It means sitting in silence without reaching for stimulation. It means allowing thoughts to arise without needing to share them, suppress them, or act on them immediately. This is uncomfortable at first. That discomfort is exactly what needs to be trained. Most people cannot sit quietly for even a short time without becoming restless. The mind looks for something to consume, something to react to, something to fill the space. This restlessness is not personality, it is conditioning. Old age brings long hours of quiet. If the mind is not trained, those hours become heavy. Memories replay, regrets surface, fear multiplies. The mind turns against itself because it was never taught to simply sit. People often say they fear loneliness in old age, but what they really fear is facing their own mind without distraction. Training the mind to be alone means slowly reducing dependence on external stimulation. It does not mean cutting off relationships. It means not needing them to feel whole. Try it in small ways. Sit without music. Walk without something in your ears. Eat without a screen in front of you. Notice how quickly the mind looks for escape. Don't judge it, observe it. At first, silence feels louder. Thoughts become sharper, emotions become clearer. This often makes people return to noise immediately. But if you stay, something changes. The mind begins to settle. It stops demanding constant input. It starts to rest. An elderly person who is comfortable in silence does not beg for attention. They do not cling. Their presence is calm, not needy. People feel at ease around them. Compare this with someone who has never trained the mind. Silence feels like rejection. Being alone feels like failure. Bitterness replaces ease. Dependency replaces genuine connection. This suffering is preventable. The Buddha often spoke about contentment. Contentment does not mean having nothing. It means not needing more than what is already present. If your sense of meaning depends on busyness, old age will feel empty. If your sense of meaning comes from awareness itself, Old age can feel spacious. Silence will come whether you are ready for it or not. Train the mind now, while it still has energy. When loneliness loses its power over the mind, old age loses one of its sharpest edges. 4. Simplify your life before you are forced to. Old age has no patience for excess. What once felt manageable slowly becomes heavy, not all at once, piece by piece. And when people finally notice the weight, they are often already too tired to carry it. The Buddha spoke about attachment not as a moral issue, but as a practical one. Attachment is not only about desire, it is about accumulation. Too many things, too many roles, too many unresolved tensions. Old age does not add new burdens. It exposes the ones you have been carrying all along. Most people live complex lives without fully realizing it. They fill days with obligations they never question. They collect possessions they do not use. They maintain relationships out of habit rather than genuine care. They carry old resentments for years, replaying arguments that ended long ago. While young, they have the energy to manage this complexity. When energy fades, complexity turns into suffering. Old age will simplify your life whether you choose it or not. The question is whether you simplify consciously or painfully. A cluttered life demands constant attention. A simple life conserves it. Simplifying does not mean abandoning responsibility. It means removing what does not serve clarity, peace, or genuine necessity. It means learning to tell the difference between what is essential and what is merely habitual. Possessions are an obvious place to start. Every object you own requires space, maintenance, attention, and eventually some form of disposal. While young, people underestimate this cost. In old age, it becomes visible. A house full of unused things becomes a burden, not a comfort. But simplification goes much further than physical possessions. Old age has little tolerance for emotional clutter. Unresolved anger, guilt, jealousy, and long-held resentment become louder in silence. People often believe time heals these things. It does not. Avoidance keeps them alive. Forgiveness and compassion are practical here, not noble gestures. They free the mind. Carrying old grudges into old age is like carrying stones uphill when your legs are already weak. Simplify your emotional life now. Say what needs to be said. Apologize where it is genuine. Let go where repair is no longer possible. Stop replaying old injuries. You are not protecting yourself. You are exhausting yourself. Relationships also deserve honest attention. Not every connection needs to be maintained. Some consistently drain more than they nourish. While young, people tolerate this for social reasons. In old age, the cost of that tolerance becomes clear. This does not mean cutting people off harshly. It means reducing exposure to what consistently disturbs the mind. Simplifying commitments matters too. Many people overcommit out of fear. Fear of becoming irrelevant, fear of disappointing others, fear of being forgotten. Old age exposes how unsustainable this is. When energy decreases, every unnecessary obligation becomes a source of strain. Learn to say no before the body forces you to. There is also the area of expectation. Many people carry rigid expectations about how old age should look, how others should treat them, how much respect they deserve. When these expectations are not met, bitterness grows quietly. Simplifying expectations reduces disappointment. Society moves on, roles shift, attention moves elsewhere. This is not personal. It is simply how impermanence works in everyday life. A simplified life is not an empty life. It is spacious. There is room to breathe, room to observe, room to rest. When distractions fall away, what remains becomes clearer. People fear simplification because they confuse it with loss. But voluntary simplification is gentle. Forced simplification is harsh. Begin now, not in a rush. Slowly, honestly, thoughtfully. Ask yourself what truly matters when everything else is removed. Build life around that. When old age arrives, you will not feel robbed. You will feel ready. 5. Cultivate inner worth, not social value. One of the quiet shocks of old age is discovering that the world no longer measures you the way it used to. Attention fades. Opinions carry less weight. Praise becomes rare. Society does not announce this change. It simply moves on. For many people, this is more painful than physical decline. Worldly value is unstable. It rises and falls based on conditions you cannot control. Age, appearance, productivity, influence, usefulness. When these conditions shift, so does the value society assigns to you. If your sense of worth is built on these things, old age will feel like a steady erosion of identity. Most people spend their lives unconsciously tying self-worth to roles: provider, leader, worker, expert, caregiver. When those roles weaken or disappear, they feel invisible. They think something has gone wrong. In truth, they built their identity on something temporary. And anything built on temporary conditions will eventually feel unstable. Inner worth is different. It is not granted by others. It does not expire. It is cultivated through how you live when no one is watching. Virtue does not age. A kind person does not become less kind with wrinkles. An honest person does not lose honesty when strength fades. Inner worth grows quietly over time. It does not demand applause. It does not rely on attention. And because of that, it remains when social value disappears. Old age exposes the difference between these two forms of worth. Someone who lived for status feels humiliated when status fades. Someone who lived with integrity remains steady, not superior. Grounded, self-esteem often depends on comparison. Inner worth does not. It is not about feeling good. It is about being at peace with how you have lived. The Buddha never taught people to chase respect. He taught people to be respectable in their conduct. Respect from others is uncertain. Self-respect is stable. As physical strength declines, moral strength becomes more visible. People may not admire your speed, but they notice patience. They may not need your labor, but they feel your presence. Quiet integrity carries weight even when authority fades. This is why cultivating inner worth must begin now. Not because old age is imminent, but because character is built slowly. Each choice reinforces who you are becoming. If you cut corners now, inner worth weakens. If you act ethically only when convenient, it remains shallow. Old age does not hide these things. It reveals them. People who depend on social value often become bitter as they age. They feel ignored, disrespected. They reach for recognition that no longer comes. That bitterness isolates them further. This suffering is self-created, not intentionally, but through misplaced investment. Non-attachment to praise and blame is a practical teaching. It does not mean becoming indifferent. It means not letting external opinion define your sense of self. When you are young, praise feels nourishing. When you are old, it becomes unreliable. A mind trained in inner worth does not starve when praise disappears. Dignity does not come from being admired. It comes from knowing you have lived in alignment with your values. That knowledge is deeply stabilizing, even when the body fails, even when memory weakens, even when independence declines. Inner worth remains. It is not stored in muscles or status. It is stored in how you have trained yourself to live. Old age strips away performance. You can no longer hide behind achievement or busyness. What remains is character. Do not spend a life chasing value that expires. Invest in what remains when everything else falls away. When society stops applauding, you will still be at peace with yourself. That peace is worth more than any amount of attention ever was. 6. Prepare for dependence without fear. One of the greatest fears people carry about old age is dependence. The fear of needing help, the fear of losing control, the fear of becoming a burden. This fear quietly shapes how people think about aging. and it often creates more suffering than dependence itself ever does. Everything arises through conditions. The body depends on food. The mind depends on care. Life depends on others in ways we routinely refuse to acknowledge. Old age does not create dependence. It reveals it. When people cling tightly to the idea of self-sufficiency, every loss of ability feels like a personal failure. Pride turns into anger. Gratitude turns into resentment. This is not because receiving help is harmful. It is because the mind was never prepared to receive it. Preparing for dependence does not mean giving up autonomy early. It means loosening pride gradually. A humble mind understands its limits. It does not pretend to stand completely alone. It does not collapse when support is needed. It adapts. Many people say they want to remain independent until the very end. This sounds reasonable, but it is unrealistic. Bodies break down, illness appears, strength fluctuates without warning. Planning for eternal independence is planning for disappointment. The wiser approach is to prepare mentally for moments of dependence, without fear, without bitterness. This begins with something simple. Observe how you receive help now. Do you resist assistance even when it makes sense? Do you feel embarrassed when someone supports you? Do you interpret help as evidence of weakness? These reactions reveal pride, not strength. Clinging to the image of being capable and self-reliant feels good, but that image is fragile. And old age eventually shatters fragile identities. A mind trained in humility accepts help without losing dignity. Dignity does not come from doing everything alone. It comes from responding wisely to circumstances. Gratitude is central here. When help is received with genuine gratitude instead of resentment, relationships strengthen rather than deteriorate. Care becomes cooperation rather than humiliation. The thoughts that appear in old age around dependence are worth examining closely. I used to do everything myself. Now I am useless. These are not facts, they are interpretations. Suffering comes from clinging to interpretations, not from the circumstances themselves. You are not your abilities. You are not your productivity. Awareness itself does not weaken with age. Only the conditions it observes change. Preparing for dependence also means learning to give without control while you are still able. Many people help others in ways that quietly create obligation. They keep internal records. They expect loyalty in return. This creates fear of reversal in old age. Giving freely trains the mind to understand that roles shift. Sometimes you support. Sometimes you are supported. Both are natural. When generosity is practiced without conditions, receiving later feels less like shame. It feels like balance rather than failure. Another aspect of preparation is communication. Many people avoid discussing aging, illness, and care because it is uncomfortable. But avoidance does not prevent dependence. It only prevents preparedness. Discussing future needs calmly reduces fear. It turns uncertainty into something more manageable. It allows relationships to adjust gradually rather than under the pressure of a crisis. Old age brings moments where independence fluctuates. Some days you are capable, some days you are not. A rigid mind suffers under this inconsistency. A flexible mind adapts. Flexibility is a form of strength. The bamboo bends in the storm while the rigid tree snaps. Pride resists change. Old age is nothing but change. A proud mind fights every loss. A humble mind flows with it. At the end of life, everyone becomes dependent on care. No one escapes this. Preparing for dependence is, in a quiet way, preparing for the final letting go. This preparation does not make life smaller. It makes it honest. Those who prepare suffer less, not because they are not affected, but because they are not shocked. They understand that needing others does not erase worth. Receive without shame. Give without control. When old age arrives, you will not feel diminished. You will feel human. and that understanding brings a kind of peace where fear once lived. 7. Contemplate death daily. This is the teaching most people avoid. And because they avoid it, it becomes the one that hurts them most. Old age is frightening not primarily because of weakness. It is frightening because it stands closer to death. If death is unexamined, old age becomes unbearable. If death is understood, old age loses much of its terror. The Buddha was direct about this. He did not treat death as an abstract idea or a distant event. He taught frequent contemplation of death, not occasionally, not symbolically, as a regular part of living. This makes people uncomfortable because modern life trains the mind to avoid death at all costs. We distract ourselves. We joke about it nervously. We push it into hospitals in silence. We act as if not thinking about death will somehow delay it. This is a kind of delusion. Death is not made worse by awareness. It is made worse by denial. Old age magnifies this denial. As the body weakens, the mind begins to sense the truth it has spent decades avoiding. Fear arises not because death is near, but because the mind is unprepared. It has never looked directly at the end of life, so it panics when signs appear. The Buddha taught that fear comes from attachment to the body, attachment to identity, attachment to unfinished desires, attachment to control. Death threatens all of these at once. If you wait until old age to think about death, you will think about it with fear. If you contemplate it regularly while you are still strong, you learn to face it with greater clarity. Contemplating death does not mean imagining dramatic endings. It means remembering a simple truth. This life is temporary. Its ending is uncertain. You may live long, you may not. You will definitely die. This reflection changes how you live. When death is remembered, small conflicts lose importance. Pride softens. Greed becomes more obvious. Procrastination becomes something you can no longer afford. You stop assuming there will always be more time. Old age becomes painful when people suddenly realize how much time they spent unconsciously. Regret becomes louder when the future shrinks. This regret is not caused by death. It is caused by having lived without awareness. Daily contemplation of death reduces regret. When you live with awareness of impermanence, you speak more honestly. You forgive sooner. You stop wasting energy on what does not matter. People fear that thinking about death will make them depressed. Usually the opposite is true. Avoiding death creates a low, persistent anxiety. Facing it creates clarity. Old age is often described as a time of reflection, but reflection without preparation becomes rumination. Memories replay endlessly. Missed opportunities feel heavy. Fear of the unknown dominates the mind. A mind that has regularly contemplated death experiences old age differently. It sees aging as the confirmation of a truth already known. Yes, this body is declining. This was always expected. There is sadness, but not panic. There is seriousness, but not despair. There is also something worth understanding here. Death is not only something that happens at the very end. Change is happening constantly. Cells die, roles die, relationships die, youth dies. Each moment is a small ending. If you can accept small endings daily, the final ending becomes less of a shock. Contemplating death also exposes false priorities. People often plan endlessly for futures they may never reach, while neglecting inner development entirely. Old age reveals this imbalance. Those who trained only for comfort struggle when comfort disappears. Those who train the mind remain more stable even when conditions deteriorate. There is also a kind of freedom that comes from this practice. When you truly accept that death is certain and its timing is uncertain, the fear of minor losses decreases. You stop clinging so tightly. You stop trying to control everything. You become more present in ordinary moments. Old age is frightening when people feel unfinished. It is quieter when people feel they have lived consciously. At the end of life, external supports weaken, the body weakens, sensory pleasures fade, social roles dissolve. What remains is the mind. If the mind has never been trained to face impermanence, death will feel like something stolen. If the mind has been trained, death feels more like a natural conclusion. This does not mean there will be no fear at all. It means less confusion, less resistance, less panic. Contemplating death daily is not about obsessing over dying. It is about learning how to live without illusion. Sit quietly sometimes. This life is uncertain. Death is certain. What matters today? Let that question guide your choices. Old age rewards those who have asked this question early. Those who never did are forced to ask it when time is short, energy is low, and fear is high. When death is no longer avoided, old age no longer feels like a threat. It feels like a final season of clarity. Old age is not a mistake. It is not a punishment. It is not something that suddenly goes wrong at the end of life. It is the natural result of causes and conditions unfolding exactly as they always have. What makes old age unbearable is not weakness or slowness or the need for help. What makes it unbearable is being unprepared. If you accept aging before it arrives, the mind does not panic when change begins. If you discipline the body while it still listens, the body supports you instead of collapsing early. If you train the mind to be alone, silence does not feel like abandonment. If you simplify your life, old age feels lighter rather than overwhelming. If you cultivate inner worth, fading attention does not wound you. If you prepare for dependence, needing help does not destroy your dignity. If you contemplate death daily, old age does not terrify you. None of this is dramatic. None of this is complicated. And none of it can be done at the last minute. Old age reveals how you lived. It does not change who you are. It exposes it. Those who lived unconsciously suffer more consciously at the end. Those who lived consciously suffer less when the end approaches. This is not harsh. This is simply how the path works. You do not prepare for old age by chasing youth. You prepare by training the mind, caring for the body, and letting go of illusions. Old age is coming, whether you are ready or not. What you have done with the time before it arrives is what will determine whether it breaks you or simply clarifies everything. And in the end, clarity may be the most honest gift available. Not happiness, not comfort, not control. Clarity, in seeing only seeing, in hearing only hearing, in aging simply aging. Nothing added, nothing resisted, just what is.